There's a story of the settlers where Iceland was actually grown with forest from the beach to the mountains. And that loss was something that the older generation was grieving a lot. This is Vatnajökull glacier, the largest glacier in Iceland. At the thickest, it's about 1,000 meters, and the ice that is at the edges is as old as the whole history of Iceland. Scientists believe that it will disappear in the next 100-200 years because of climate change. And you can see the collapse here all around the periphery of the glacier. The issue is so big that it's in a way larger than language. It's larger than what our mind can grasp. And just like a black hole, you can't look straight into a black hole, and you can't stand in the middle of this ice sheet and understand how it's leaving. You understand the black hole by looking not straight at it, but at the periphery, how it's pulling in neighboring stars and galaxies. And to understand this glacier, you have to look at the past, you have to look at the future, you have to look at the science, but also the mythology. You have to look personally, but you have to also think how this is affecting us globally, because all this ice here would add about 1 centimeter to the world oceans. And that is quite a lot, because we have 100 of these that is leaving at the same time. So this is not telling us just the story of the glacier itself, it's telling us a story of a planet that is going out of balance.
It's our great privilege to welcome Andri Snær Magnason, Icelandic author and environmental activist, to the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. His book on time and water has been translated into more than 30 languages and being read around the world. It's different from all other climate books I know, and it's deeply meaningful. Welcome, Andri.
Thank you, Wolfgang, and hello, everyone. It's a great honor to be here in Potsdam. Actually, one of the main instigators for me writing this book is in this room, Wolfgang Lucht. And he challenged me, he asked me, why don't I write about climate change? And I said, well, I'm not a professor, I'm not a scientist. But he said, you're a storyteller. And people don't understand data, but they understand stories. And if nobody does that, then we won't have this paradigm shift that we need to avoid the catastrophe of what we see in the data.
We have so much fossil fuels in the ground that we know if we burned it all, it would probably be enough to melt large parts of Antarctica, even though it would take thousands of years. And this is a huge sea level rise, 60, 70 meters for all of Antarctica. So this is in a far future. Are we responsible for what happens in 5,000 years or in 10,000 years? But the challenge to humanity is to say, we know these fossil fuels are there, but we want to leave them in the ground because we feel responsible for the far future of Earth. So this is an example of a process that we can only prevent in this generation.
When a scientist says 2100, we don't feel anything. Why do we feel like it's so eternally long and we're so extremely irresponsible for dates like 2100? My grandmother, she was a big role model for us, and she only died like 6 weeks ago. 98 years old, and she was one of the first women in Iceland to fly. And I was so lucky to actually talk to somebody that was almost 100 years old, and I could ask these people, are 100 years a long time or a short time? And they would tell me, it's a very short time. So when you look at your data, you feel like you're watching mythology, because in my life, our children's life, if they become scientists, they can measure bigger change than maybe scientists for 1,000 years. What will this story be? What's the mythology?
I think we need a new cosmology. So cosmology is something where you express your view of how humans belong into the world, how the world belongs into the cosmos, and therefore how humans belong into the cosmos. What is our place?
þessar slæðismyndir sem hérna.
Þetta flotta kortin, þetta hérna uppdrátt Íslandskortin. Já. Þetta var bara eða ramminn, sko.
I think this is a selfie. Of course, you can't capture a whole life, but our family life is quite well documented because this is just grandfather, and then my father has a lot.
He left us with like 40,000 slides that we now have in all sorts of boxes, all mixed together.
There are so many stories here. Hérna er að vera að klifra upp á Hvannaþarasjökul.
Þú veist, það er línu til þess að detta ekki hún sprungu.
Þeir fóru þarna Vatnajökull bara 1950 og það var enginn sem hafði farið þarna og margir sem staðir höfðu engin nöfn einu sinni þegar þeir voru að fara. I grew up with these amazing stories my grandparents would tell me about the first glacial expeditions of the Icelandic Glacial Research Society. But they were common people, they were citizen scientists. These photos are stories of a very different time and actually almost difficult for us to imagine how people accomplished things like building a hut on top of one of the most hostile mountains that is also one of the most active volcanoes in Iceland.
They have the word mandrapsveður, homicide weather, or like
man-killing storm.
Yeah, man-killing weather.
We would say these guys, he and his friends, they loved hardship.
They loved hardship.
That's what they're really into.
Probably all for the stories, and all to come down and tell each other stories about how it was. It's like an experiment in resilience.
Kind of this is how mythology is created. Og bara ferðast svona snjó og ef eitthvað bilaði, þá þurfti bara að laga bílinn þarna. Það var enginn sem að...
Þannig að hann getur verið að grafa hann upp úr sprungu eða eitthvað, skilur?
Þau voru ótrúlega heppin af því að það vissi enginn hver sprungurnar voru á jöklinum.
So you would grow up with your great-grandfather who was just a normal person, a meat salesman during winter or so on. But then you'd actually discover all of these photos and you'd see that he would be going on these incredible explorations, absolutely humble about it. It was also extremely dangerous and uncalled for. It was not in the name of anything, really.
It was actually about having fun. It wasn't about anything much deeper, and maybe they were using science as an excuse to have fun.
It feels like it's a scientific exploration, but at the same time, the photos now are actually much more valuable than maybe the research. There's documentation now that exists of a landscape that wasn't expected to change, that looks totally different now, only half a century later.
Some of the first stories we were bragging about as kids were like, our grandmother's so cool. She's one of the first ladies to fly in Iceland, and she was fearless in these glacial expeditions. She's been on the highest peak in Iceland many times. So these kind of family legends, the kind of stories that we were always listening to. And I think this is part of the tradition that maybe made it natural to be a storyteller. And I just, personally, I felt like, yeah, I want to tell stories too, so. I think the family stories that I've been writing about recently were very early on embedded in myself. Epic, strange, heroic glacial stories that my grandparents would tell me, and then stories of the northernmost point of Iceland, where my grandfather was born in a kind of isolated farm. My mother's parents, the glacial explorers, they would bring us into nature and teach us to enjoy and respect. And then I was lucky to have grandparents on the other side, in the north of Iceland, just under the Arctic Circle. And they had in them the survival of 1,000 years, using driftwood, collecting eider down, eating everything that could fly, swim, or run, basically living off the land, very connected to the place, the stories, and the resources. Hlynur, ertu að koma? Þú ert drifið þig? Ert þú með stór úlpu?
Ég er með skél.
Ok, hafa nú bara. Er hún hlýið það?
Já, það er svona prímaluft.
Það er með stuttbuxur, það er sána í...
Sána?
Já. Ertu með húfu? Húfu?
Nei, með...
Vettlinga? Ertu með þykka vettlinga?
Ég mætti að lúfur.
Já, þetta er ekki lúfur, þetta er bara... Hvað sagði þig?
Sæll Hlynur, gaman að sjá þig.
Svoleiðis.
Sæll Hlynur. Sæll. Gaman að sjá þig.
Svoleiðis.
Hérna ætlaðir að fara að virkja.
Yeah. This is Þjórsá, it's a glacial river. They're going to build a dam down here. And most of the area we're driving now would be flooded behind that reservoir. Iceland has already dammed much more than needs of the nation. 95% of the energy that is produced in Iceland goes to aluminum and Bitcoin. So in Iceland we had engineers and they were always claiming that a glacial river was running for nothing because it was not going through a dam, it was not producing electricity. While more advanced modern biology was telling us that the river, the ocean and the glacier were connected in a way that the glacier was actually feeding marine life with these muddy waters. We pretended that we understood. We pretended that we had everything under control. While in maybe the older traditions, they had to address things with humility, which we have not done.
Það bjart inn eftir Andri minn.
Já, þetta er yndislegt.
Hvar erum við núna, segirðu?
Nú erum við bara á leiðinni hérna inn í Jökulheima.
I think Icelanders always felt they were struggling against nature. I don't think we even felt that we were in any kind of harmony with nature. I think nature always had the upper hand throughout history. So we always think that humans are tiny compared to the major forces of nature, like volcanic eruptions or geothermal areas. But actually, humans have outgrown most of Earth's forces. It's a mythological time. And that is because of fire. In Greek mythology, it's Prometheus that stole fire from the gods and gave the power of fire to humans. This kind of origin story of human civilization and power. And the gods were angry at Prometheus and they punished him by an eagle that gnawed out his liver. If if we look at the consequences of that single act, how that fire lit other fires that lit other fires, we have used this fire to make us into some kind of gods. We fly into space, we dive into the oceans. So the gods were right, and now humans have created the greatest fires that Earth has ever seen. Bigger than the forest fires, bigger than the volcanoes. But the thing is that these fires are hidden. We don't see fires in the cars or the factories or how our homes are heated. And we are now shaking the elements of everything. We're not just changing empires, we're not just changing ideas. We are merging glaciers with oceans. This is a time of the great water shift, which is only comparable to the greatest events, not in world history, but in geological history. So it's not a chapter change in our history books, it's a chapter change in geology books. It's basically a fundamental shift in what this planet is. And that is a creation story or a destruction story. So my grandparents, exactly 66 years ago, they went this way on their honeymoon. They got married the day before, went the day after. It took almost 2 days to get here. My grandparents were part of a glacial research team. They were mountaineers, but they were traveling as volunteers with scientists. They were part of these first annual spring trips to map and measure Vatnajökull glacier, which is one of Europe's biggest ice caps. It's 8,000 square kilometers. So they were 3 weeks on the glacier, mapping, measuring, and traveling. My grandmother, she died in March, and it had always been my childhood dream to go on a trip like this. I managed to tell her just before she died, like a few days before, and she was like, oh, she envied me so much. She said, I wish I could wind myself up and go with you. So when you visit a glacier, it's beautiful, and you don't know maybe how it was 10 years ago. And you don't really feel something is wrong. But if you start reading the landscape, then you can see it has left marks. So this mound here will probably not be here next year, but now it's really a very good reminder, because probably when my grandparents were here,
yeah, it must have been like
the glacier must have been like 300 meters up, probably, all the way to the edge over there. And those mounds are kind of the leftover of the glacier's edge. My son Hlynur, he's 25. And I think it's important for him to see what is happening and understand it. We were both deeply inspired by my grandparents, and he actually became very close to my grandfather, and he has his grandfather's camera. It's called dead ice. It's like you're just watching climate change in real time. This is something that fell 1,000 years ago, moved to the edge of the glacier maybe 50 years ago, and now there's no movement from the top of the glacier down here anymore. It's just detached, so that's why it's called dead ice. It melts and then it's gone. But it's clean. It's before the Industrial Revolution. It's water uncontaminated with anything. My son will probably be going here in 50 years, and he will be an eyewitness to change that should normally take 500 years. So we're driving now on land that hasn't seen sky for 1,000 years. This is just freshly from under hundreds of meters of snow or ice for the last 1,000 years, at least, maybe longer. So we're on a new frontier here. We are in this impossible dilemma now of scientifically knowing we are not making life better, not for the planet, not for the species, and therefore not for ourselves. So my kind of sincere attempt in my book or talks or that is to update our sense of time, our sense of continuity, our sense of responsibility, because we are not acting today like we were responsible for the future of climate change.
Það svo aðeins lengra til hægri og svo förum við að kemur okkur í norðrið.
But I can use my grandmother to understand that the chain of love, the people that I know and love, the people that create me, the people that I will know and love, the people I will create. My daughter becomes as old as my grandmother in the year 2100. My daughter might have a favorite 20-year-old at that time that will remember my daughter in the year 2170 maybe. Okay, the data says 2100. It's meaningless. But the person my daughter will love the most is maybe out there in the year 2140. That has meaning, and that is an unwritten story. But I can understand that story by reflecting it on my grandmother's story.
Nei, ég var bara að segja, farðu hérna beint áfram og reynum að koma okkur aðeins upp. Já, ég á leiðinni. Oh, you are so cute. See?
What do we do to little birdie?
We take it with us.
Don't think we've ever found a bird on the glacier. So we saved it. We hope we can get him back and he will have something to drink, maybe some seeds. This might be the canary in the coal mine. No idea where he came from. We don't see birds like this on glaciers.
It's also so tiny.
Very small.
So it's not like it's been traveling.
It's almost like it can't fly, so it's like, how did it get there? Actually, my grandmother had lots of these little birds in her house. So I think she's joining us on the trip. So my grandmother, I think she went for the last time on the glacier, maybe 15 years ago. Of course, the older generation are always bragging about their youth, but these expeditions were more like a polar expedition today, traveling up to these uncharted, unnamed entities that are spread over thousands of square kilometers of Iceland. Fyrir rauðbílinn eða?
Já.
Þannig að við erum farin úr Grímsvötn.
Já.
Og þetta að taka borkjarna úr Grímsvötnunum sjálfum.
Já. Nei, það er áhvert að sjá þetta. Mér er alltaf langað, ég var svo forvitin að
So we're here in Grímsfjall, and all these red dots distributed over the whole of Vatnajökull glacier. We have these mass balance points we visit every spring and then again in the fall. And by doing that, we can get an annual health check of the glacier.
Þetta er flott.
Allur kanturinn á henni er að fara í áttina að fjallinu, þar sem það bráðnar.
Já, og af hverju bráðnar það hjá fjallinu?
Af því að þar er jarðhitavirkni.
Já.
Það er það sem að býr til cirka helminginn af vatninu hérna. Hinn helmingurinn kemur af því að það er að bráðna á öllu svæðinu.
Merkilegt. Takk fyrir hvað?
Þessi var bara að fara að byggja stílbretti bara, þá erum við...
So Andros is a lake.
Yes, there is a lake, but there is very little water in it.
Very little water?
Currently.
Okay.
We have about 310 meters of ice below us.
Yeah.
And then there is water, and then we have the bottom of the lake below that.
How far back does the catalogue go?
Well, here it's been done since 1950, more or less.
So this has been done since the 50s?
Yes.
Then they didn't have the drill, they did.
A lot of work.
So I see in the old photos enormous ditches that they were always digging.
They had to do a ditch that was about 10 meters long.
Vatnajökull is one of the few locations in the world where you have very dense continuous measurements, because you wouldn't be able to do it like for the Greenland ice sheet. It would take hundreds of people many months to do it in the same extent.
So what you see here is how we measure the thickness of the liquid snow. So we drill, we take out the core and we weigh it in order to know how much water equivalent that will be.
When they started measuring, they did not, in their wildest dreams, believe the glacier could be in danger. Or what?
No, I don't. They were not thinking about that even.
No.
It was only at the beginning of the 20th century that people were really realizing that there had been past ice ages and stuff like that. So it's all quite new.
Yeah.
We can estimate if it's essentially losing mass or gaining mass, but the overall trend is pretty clear that we're in a continuous rate of rapid mass loss.
So the glacier is like a pile of ice on a huge mountain range, and then leaking from that, because it's almost like very slow-moving liquid, are these valley glaciers, and they calve into glacial lakes. And these are some of the most beautiful, dramatic and dangerous landscapes Iceland has. They really shape Icelandic identity. Glaciers are still, even in the mind of Icelanders, kind of distant, kind of hostile. And I would say that our relationship with glaciers are more like relationships with a shark or a predator. Glaciers in Icelandic history were in the context of eternity. They had always been there and they felt like they would always be there. But now humans are changing all aspects of water on the planet. In the lifetime of a single human being, they will feel a bigger change in the world oceans than not all his ancestors, but 10 times the evolution of mankind. And there we are in proportions that are just beyond language, beyond everything. We're in mythology. And how do you write about something that is larger than language? Maybe you have to understand beauty and poetry and love. Who do I love that will experience this in the hard way?
í Grímsvötnum á Kraka, gistar hlýjan Skálatindi á, og líð á skíðum leiðina til baka, ljúfan goss í jökulheimum þrá. Vatnajökull veitir gestum sínum, veislukost af gleð og rómantík, og hann mun betur svala sorgum þínum, en set á knæpu niðri í Reykjavík.
It's just a dream come true to sleep in the cabin that my grandfather built in the 50s with his friends. So I just wanted to offer you sincere gratitude. I have been gathering stories from this place almost all my life. From the wedding trip and the building of these cabins in extreme weathers when grandmother and grandfather were stuck for 3 days in the tent. And I asked them, weren't you cold? And they said, cold, we were just married. And Omar and his brother were so gracious to take us here and you guys to open up these cabins. And it's been a really long time dream also to bring my son to continue this legend. So I just wanted to really thank you for giving us this opportunity.
I'm really trying to get the vibe from my grandfather's photos. I actually found his old Rolleiflex that was just sitting in a closet somewhere, and it of course it's just like works like clockwork. So it was amazing to get the first roll. Það var staðfest að það hefði verið hérna, en ekki í Egyptalandi.
Basically, the founding idea of this community to teach people to love glaciers, like a cause. It's a very strange thing in the 50s that this is what they were thinking about. I think it's much more than special, this society, and beautiful, because everybody's equal. Men, women, scientists, mountain lovers, and truck drivers. Because everybody understands on the glacier that everybody's equally relying on each other.
Svakalegir hólar. Mér finnst það smá óþægilegt þegar maður stígur og því að nú yfirborðslagið allt tengt.
Þetta klikkað staður. Ríkur upp vatnum, ætla að sé. Þetta bara aska.
Já. Þetta bara grjót innan úr jörðin.
Þetta ógeðslega flott. They were not only enjoying themselves on the mountain, but actually aligning themselves with science and discovery, and basically now that knowledge is a very critical knowledge for this century, actually. I don't think they knew what context they were creating this knowledge for, but this data set of 70 years is something that is actually crucial to understand how the next 70 years will be. Even though you've read about it and spoken about it, it is difficult to mourn this process of the glacier vanishing in 200 years, because you're more overwhelmed by the presence of it.
I'm grateful to see it as it is right now. It's going to look different in 50 years, and I'm going to come back here in 50 years, absolutely. I mean, you can still see on the cliffs over there where there's like 50 meters of ice that are just slowly tumbling off the cliff, and it's a 100-year process. Then it's larger than beauty, and it's larger than grief as well. So the main thing you can do in a site like this is just to feel and to witness.
What's the most important thing about witnessing?
Whoa. It's witnessing.
Yeah, this.
It's the most important in my work. Witnessing is to witness and then tell the story. I think mythology can help people grasp reality and the world that we live in. And I think that's one of the roles of these stories, is to create these equations that explain the bigger picture. The combined rationality of our systems, our governments, science, is an Earth going off the rails. So it feels like more and more and more people are thinking about, okay, what did we not put into this equation? We did not put love, spirit, beauty, and fun. I think many of us want permission to break out of these constraints of reality and look for connections in nature that I think every single generation of our ancestors since the dawn of man actually felt. And I feel like sometimes it was religion, superstition, folklore, this realm of feeling something is higher than ourselves. And I think we are in that state of understanding that if more places on Earth were even holy, then we would not be faced with this melting of glaciers and apocalyptic scenarios of droughts and fires. And then the question is, why did we stop finding holiness in nature? How can we find it again? So little bird was 2 weeks and he died last night. We thought he might be a little sign from grandmother that really wanted to join us on the journey. And maybe she also wanted to rest a bit here, close to the cabin where she and grandfather spent their honeymoon party. I really wanted to see it fly into the birch forest, but my take is that it's always worth trying. And even if it sometimes doesn't go as you want, it's still worth trying.